Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week, and welcome. I feel like we need to edit in some jazzy fireworks, but welcome to our very first Policy Pulse segment. If you listened to the episode back on February 18th with my esteemed guest, Bryan Driscoll, who is officially the co-host of this segment, effectively, we shared that we were going to be breaking down policies that are kind of really making headlines or things that have really come up recently, at least specifically to the US, and kind of allowing the moment to take a look ahead and see what's on the horizon. So this Policy Pulse segment is intended to give you a ton of information in a condensed period of time so that you can get as much insight as possible into how your organization or your business may need to operate either continuously or maybe in a changed way, depending on the circumstance. So again, tons and tons of information will be packed into these segments, and you can expect them once a month. So at least that's what we're tracking for now. If these are super popular, maybe we'll do more. If you're like, whoa, it's a lot of info, we need to do these quarterly, that's okay too. Let us know your feedback once you've kind of listened to the episode. But that said, welcome back, Bryan. Thank you so much for being our resident Policy Pulse co-host on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Traci. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and give these updates. I think there's a lot happening and there's also a lot of wait and see. So it's good to stay on top of things.
Totally. I agree. I love a segment. You're not going to catch me in a moment where I'm not going to say, yeah, let's do it to a segment. I'm always going to be into a segment. So I love it. We're going to have a very specific agenda, which is actually pretty different than the way that I typically operate my podcast, as you know, because you've been a guest a few times already. So for everyone listening, we're going to talk about some different things that are present day, like things that you should know, things that might impact you depending on your business or your industry. And then we're going to move into really helping to allow you to digest what some of these things actually mean for you. And then also the impact, of course, as well as what ideas or suggestions we might have for implementation, if that's even applicable. And then we'll kind of move into what's on the horizon as we look ahead. So with that, one of the first things that I think everyone's probably thinking about is this feeling around economic uncertainty and fears around a recession in the US specifically. And in some of our research and preparing for this episode, we found, at least, we pulled together that there is this increasing concern about a potential recession in the US, such as, with policies, I should say, such as tariffs, federal spending cuts, and mass layoffs, which we've seen even this week as we're recording it at the federal level, which can and probably are contributing to economic uncertainty. So, Bryan, what are your thoughts on that from a really a policy standpoint and what people should kind of walk away with and take away?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough time. There's a ton of uncertainty. Uncertainty never does any favors to not only individuals, but also to the economy as a whole. And to your point about, mass layoffs, I think it was like 10% of last month's job losses were from the federal government. That's an enormous amount that is just not normally seen. And now those are people that, we're already having maybe some difficulty affording eggs, and now they're going without paychecks. So whether you're in the public workforce or the private workforce, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty. And I'm not an economic expert. I have some friends who are, and I have been increasing some of the text conversations with some of them recently. And the biggest thing that they're telling me is just be careful. Just watch your spending. Save where you can. Cut back on every streaming service, right? Like, just I know that the last thing that people need is budget advice when they're already not making enough money, and I feel somewhat helpless, to provide a better insight into that. But it really is true when there's so much uncertainty about just cutting where you can, because there's no telling what's coming down the line. As you said, with tariffs, that's going to cause more layoffs, as businesses have trouble making profits, and being able to pay employees. There's just a whole snowball effect of things that are happening right now, that unfortunately, there's a lot of turmoil in the moment, and it's going to take a few months before we really see how things settle. As with a lot of things that we're going to discuss in these segments, it does just take time for some of these things to settle, and have a long-term understanding of what to do.
Yeah, no, it's totally fair. I mean, I the thing is, I feel like every year of the podcast in the last 4 years, at some, I was going to say toward the end of the year, but really at some point in the year, let's say the calendar year, I talk about these, impending the feeling of impending doom, whether it's like through layoffs, economic uncertainty. So we know that these feelings are resonant pretty often. Like I think even last year I talked about how the end of the year tends to be a hot spot for layoffs. It tends to be when businesses are either evaluating where they are fiscally and seeing, well, how much can we make by the end of the year, or how much do we need to cut by the end of the year. And when I think about the that sentiment, the what I would say I would offer from like an advice standpoint is this idiom that I think translates well, which is I think it's like the seeds you plant today are the flowers of tomorrow. So I say that in the sense that for for HR partners and leaders, and maybe just leaders in general, the better you can do today to think about what your organization might look like in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, to be as future proofed as possible. Like, reduce wasteful spending, think about your hiring strategically, think about your promotions strategically, think about everything strategically. I think that sometimes leaning into the control that we do have over our business decisions allows us to feel a little bit more certainty in the long run. Like, I have learned, at least in the last few years, what it means to stretch the runway, because I've seen leaders who I've worked for take a really hard and fast look at, okay, we might need something today, but does that put us in a difficult situation tomorrow? And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that there is, of course, this element that tons of federal workers and others outside of the government have lost their jobs, and that is an issue today, and they need to figure out their next stream of income today. And also, for listeners who are listening, go figure, in terms of what they can do to best prepare themselves to feel more certain, to feel more stable, I do think it's like, how do we think as long term as we possibly can, so that we are it's honestly, it's the same thing in like personal finance. If you're spending everything you earn, you're going to have a really difficult time if something changes to your income. um I don't know. I agree. It is hard to give advice when there is this sentiment. But I also think, I always say multiple things can be true at once. I also think that there is a piece within the planning side of businesses that people can lean into in order to do the best possible thing to ensure stability through economic uncertainty.
And that's the ultimate point. Like I think you hit it on the head there. Like that, it's being proactive. And
Right.
you can only be proactive if you know what's happening. You may not have answers, and I know that can be unsatisfying. Um, but by understanding what's happening and what the most likely or even most possible outcomes could be, you can take some steps to prepare. Does this, make it difficult for small businesses? Does it make it difficult for people already working 3 jobs or 60, 70, 80 hours a week? Sure. What free time are you going to use to watch the news, read the news, and stay updated on stuff like that? But maybe that's where we come in to help with that.
Right.
But I think that you're absolutely right. Knowing what's happening is part of an individual's and a business's ability to be proactive.
Yeah, exactly. I am now also recalling that I did an episode on recession proofing a number of years ago, and it's just dawning on me that this is kind of just the way the economy and life works, is there's this up and down. And of course we know that there's there was an administration change a few years ago, and then obviously a change now, but kind of going back to a prior administration. And it'll be interesting to see, I think, how things shake out, and especially concerning things that I am not well versed in, like tariffs and spending cuts from the government specifically, and in terms of like where the money is spent. I'm not an expert on that either, but I think it will be interesting to see just how it all plays out. And I think it's just kind of like a look ahead. As you said, it's like a wait and see.
It's true because there's a lot of specifically with tariffs, to use that example. Like there's a lot of talk of um, of pulling the tariffs back, using it as a threat more than anything, even if it's implemented and then, revoked 24, 48 hours later, like happened last week.
Hmm.
Um, I I do think that just speaking about tariffs is just not good policy. It raises prices, and once prices go up, they never come down, and that's hard for anyone or any business to absorb. And
Hmm.
it just causes a ripple effect. To your
Hmm.
point, like it not only creates more uncertainty, but also creates a ripple effect of economic problems that put more fear in people. And
No,
that
yeah. Yeah, it's there's nothing scarier than the idea of financial ruin, right? Like that's arguably, not to point in jest to something very serious, but that's like arguably the scariest thing. Um, to add a little personal light anecdote here, I actually started baking homemade English muffins because of how expensive they were. So, and actually, I did a dang good job. Like they are some delicious English muffins. So now I'm like, I'm not spending all that money on English muffins from a very notable brand anymore. And nor am I going to buy the generic ones. I'm just going to make them from scratch. I'm just a regular old homemaker over here running a podcast, working full time and stuff like that. But yeah, find me for some English muffins. So, I mean, it's all of what we've talked about is so it's heavy. It's heavy. Like people want stability. They want stability in their jobs. They want stability in their home lives. They want stability in their relationships. And they want stability in their country, and just macroeconomically. All of that matters. So I appreciate you going through some of that with us. And there is an article from Business Insider that I will link in the show notes if anyone wants to read a little bit further on some of the odds around a recession economy, from Polymarket. So with that, one of the other topics that we should discuss is this shift in corporate culture and labor relations. There's been, even since we did some of this research, there's been more to come out of, especially the labor relations side of things, in terms of who's been appointed to different things and where the National Labor Review Board has stood on some things. So, just generally speaking, there was an article from Axios about like being in this big boss era, and that managers are in their big boss era. And I had to take a step back and say, like, are we really using that phrase? Like, I just have such an issue with the phrase. I'm like, what? Why? Okay. Anyway, basically, it means that worker empowerment has gained post pandemic. So of course, with like the Great Resignation and the visibility into increased union activity, which we've seen over the last couple of years, those things have diminished. So what once was kind of like on this upward trajectory, especially in the last couple of years, I guess has now either plateaued or has started to fall. Um, and then the article also talks about how work-life balance, flexibility, and diversity, as we talked about back in February, are being sidelined. And there are some key figures who are advocating for rigorous work weeks. And there is certainly a display from many at the government level, kind of placing this distrust on remote work. And so, of course, this is all highlighting a broader trend of industry leaders reclaiming, let's say, quote unquote, control over workplace culture. Because especially when we put this into context, I think the way that I put it during COVID, when I first started my podcast, is that workers were now in the driver's seat. And the workers, if we think about this like from a visual perspective, there's been a bit of a shift where now the employee or the worker is in a bit of the passenger seat, maybe even in the middle seat between, if we're talking about like a pickup truck, between the driver and the passenger side. And so it feels like there's a bit of an entanglement between what the employees are demanding and what bosses, let's use that term, bosses are expecting, especially when we see some of these key figures in US society and politics who are, have really deeply held beliefs on remote work and work weeks in general. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would start by saying, never mind the fact that the president and his largest campaign donor both work remotely. So, like, arguing
I didn't
against
realize
remote
that
work
actually.
is kind of hypocritical. I am not a person who advocates um, for broad statements across the board,
Right.
that remote work is bad, period, or in-office work is bad, period. Obviously, there are some jobs that require in-person activities, so that's not really up for debate or discussion. But for the jobs that allow for remote or hybrid work, why not? Like,
Hmm.
what is the ultimate issue for employers? In my view, it's control. It's that, to your point about the pendulum swinging, I think the pendulum is swinging as a society, but I think that we're actually seeing some simultaneous pendulums sort of emerge, because there are some employers that are keeping that pendulum to the employee side
Hmm.
and saying, you
Definitely.
know what? Flexibility has worked for us. Remote work has worked for us. Not only have we saved money because we don't have a large office, we're not, stocking it with candy and kegs to keep people in the office
Kegs,
14 hours a
candy and
day.
kegs. That's a new event. I like it. That's our next segment.
I
God.
love it. I'm on board.
Yeah.
Um, those types of things are being cut, so the businesses are saving money. They're also able to attract better talent because they're not having to recruit from within, a 30-mile radius of their office. They can recruit nationally or globally. There's just so many benefits when work can be done remotely. There are so many benefits to both employers and employees. And the
Mhm.
companies that see that, the companies that understand that, um, are the ones that are sort of leading the charge, and that pendulum still hanging over there on the employee side. I would also make the argument that it's actually those types of companies and those business leaders are not seeing it as a pendulum swung all the way to employees being in the driver's seat. They're seeing it as the balance that companies have been seeking for decades, of how do we find the best talent to work efficiently and to make the business the most money. When
Mhm.
possible, remote work is often the way to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, I 100% agree. Look, you're always going to find me advocating for remote work because I don't know that I would still be working if I weren't remote, frankly. If I didn't have to, um I don't know that I would want to miss this time with my daughters. I've said this very candidly, And I am very grateful that I have that choice, and that I have the opportunity to be remote. That said, I thought about something that I didn't think about before, so I'm fully hitting you with a question that you might be unprepared for. Lucky you. Um, I'm wondering, do you think now, of course, we still have to talk about some of like the public and private sector elements of this. Do you, but putting that aside for the moment, do you think that there's any element of this like strong arm push against remote work that comes from this like ideology around keeping things like in-house, so to speak, meaning onshore in the US? Now, obviously, sometimes that is more expensive for businesses because remote work has enabled businesses to be strategic and think globally, which of again that of course allows strategy and financial decisions because salaries depending on where someone's hiring can be very different with the same level of talent, as compared to someone in the US. So I'm curious, like, do you get any sense that this could be a push, like a part of a bigger picture that's focusing on jobs in the US at all? Or
It
am I
could,
like pulling something out of a hat?
I don't think you're pulling something out of a hat. I would say that it's I agree with what you're saying that there's the possibility that this is sort of a nationalist agenda, this push for in-office work. I think and not to be dismissive of that because I do
Hmm.
think there's something to that. I think the core of it is money because
Okay.
I think the core of it is companies have these long-term leases on
Mm-hmm.
office space. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to see it go empty. They want to fill that space. The commercial real estate have all these office
Yeah.
spaces, all these high rises in metro areas that are not empty. They're mostly still occupied. Um, but they want to make sure that they have a long-term investment. Some buildings cost billions of dollars, and like the property managers want to make sure that they're recouping that investment
Sure.
over a couple of decades. And so they want to keep businesses in the office. And I think that's ultimately what it is. It's just the core of it anyway, is it's money. It's
Yeah,
always money.
that's a good point. I mean, I can say from, being in New York, I lived in the city during COVID and I'm from New Jersey. Like this is just home. Like there's no like escaping the city, so to speak. Which many people did. And in that exodus that happened, ton of real estate became vacant, especially commercial real estate, to your point. And businesses did definitely struggle to get people back because people really enjoyed the flexibility. There's also what we're seeing with Gen Z, especially, and maybe even the generation after them potentially, which I think is Gen Alpha, maybe. I don't know.
I
Maybe.
think.
I
I'm
think.
not sure. I'm too old to keep
Yeah,
up on
I
that
know,
stuff now.
same. Like, I just let me know. Just email me or DM me what it is, and it's fine. Just tell me I'm wrong. I agree. I want to be too old for it too. They want maximum flexibility. They want to choose when they come in. They want the ability to come in, but they also want to be remote, and they want to tell you what number of days are. They don't even want to commit to a number of days. They want it to be super completely hyper flexible, which I love. But this, like, doesn't that kind of work for both? Doesn't that work for the business and the employee?
It absolutely does. There is tons of data to suggest that Gen X and younger, or sorry, Gen Z and younger are seeking that hybrid environment, that flexible environment. Partly because the office is traditionally a social space. It
Hmm.
is a space to meet new people, to make some friends, um, and because of I don't know, technology, phones, computers, game consoles, like everything, blame it on whatever you want. Younger generations don't have the same social environment, in-person social environment that older generations got in their youth. partly because of coming of age, coming of working age during the pandemic, that certainly played a role in that. But I think some of those generations are looking to experience the office, not every day, not for 40, 60 hours a week.
Yeah, and not when you
To
tell
your
them.
point, right, to your point, on a flexible basis. You know what? I've got this group of friends. We all work at the same company. One of them said they need to go to the office today and texted us, and three others are going to show up. Like that's the kind of stuff that they want. I don't necessarily see a problem with that because again, to your point, that's the balance.
Yeah.
That's where compromise is oftentimes great, and that's a great compromise. Not fully remote, not fully in office. Does it mean that you've got to live close to an office? I would argue not necessarily, because flexibility means that if
You
you
can figure
live
it out.
in, yeah, you can figure it out. If you live in a different state, maybe you go into the office once a week because you've got family near the office, and you're going there, for a long weekend once a month or something like that. Like that, to me, flexibility is determined by what works for the individual and what works for the company.
Yeah, totally agree. When we think about this and maybe even the economic uncertainty topic, is there anything, I should say, excuse me, that the listeners should think about when it comes to their businesses? Is there anything like right now that, depending on the sector or the industry, that directly impacts them that they need to be considerate of?
I think not. It's not even from a truly financial perspective. I think what we talked about before, understanding what's going on in the country, in the world, to be able to make some proactive steps is important. But I think one thing to sort of know about and be aware of is um, relating to one of the things you mentioned earlier, the National Labor Relations Board. And a few years ago, there was a lot of news about non-compete agreements and how those were. The federal government said, the Biden administration said, those are probably violating federal law because they're too restrictive. The new acting general counsel of the NLRB has said that we're doing away with that policy. Businesses can now use non-competes as they wish. The big caveat to that is that most non-competes fall under state law, and that's where employers need to be real careful about hearing this news from the NLRB and being like, oh, okay, we're going to, go back to our old ways of using non-competes and restricting employees geographically and for a time after they leave. I don't recommend doing that. Again, broad statement. I don't recommend doing that because so much non-compete law falls under state law, and so you need to talk with your employment lawyer and HR consultant or whatever, someone who is knowledgeable about your individual state laws to make sure that you are adhering to those state laws, regardless of what the National Labor Relations Board has said.
Right. It's a good thing to keep keep a focus on as we continue to see things probably come up about that. I mean, that has been quite the topic, and I'm curious, as we kind of come to a close here, is there anything else on the horizon that we should kind of keep an eye out for? Especially thinking about what our segment might look like next month.
I think there's a lot of, as we've talked about, there's a lot of wait and see right now with things that are happening. And one of those things that I anticipate, yes, to your point, over the next couple of months, we will start hearing some finality from the Supreme Court and other courts that are currently hearing cases. One of them that I would keep an eye on is Ames versus Ohio. That's a Supreme Court case that they heard oral arguments on it last week or the week before. Um, the very short version, the plaintiff Ames is a straight white woman, and she claims that she was discriminated against because someone who identifies as LGBTQ plus was promoted and not her. Um, the court seemed, I listened to some of the oral arguments, the court seemed kind of to follow along party lines, but seems like they may lower the standard. Essentially, the discrimination standard generally speaking, white people are not discriminated against in the workforce. And so the bar for claiming discrimination is slightly higher than for minorities who are more often discriminated against in the workforce. The Supreme Court may just make it an even bar across the board.
Got it. Okay, so definitely a wait and see. I appreciate you walking through that with us. I have pretty much no eyes on like from an expertise standpoint on case law because I'm not an attorney, but thankfully you are. So I'm sure we'll continue to lean into your expertise. But thank you so much for our very first Policy Pulse segment. And for all of the listeners out there, we really appreciate you tuning in every week in general for the podcast, but especially for this segment. And again, you will hopefully see this segment every month. That's kind of what we're starting with. It's loose, right? Like if we want to do more, we will. If we have to do a little bit less, we will. But you can definitely count on this for a monthly cadence for now. And if you liked this episode, please let us know either by DM or email. You can find all of the contact info in the show notes, including where you can connect with Bryan and me directly. And if you have any questions specific to policies in the U.S., or even otherwise, maybe we need to potentially expand because there's a lot, especially in North America, considering all of the conversations we've had around tariffs. If there are any questions from other North American residents, so to speak, let us know and we'll do our best to kind of guide the conversation along. But again, topics, suggestions, questions, anything like that, reach out to myself or Bryan, and we will see you in a month. And for everyone else who listens to the podcast regularly, I'll see you for our regularly scheduled program next week. Thank you so much, Bryan. Really appreciate it. I'm so glad we're doing this segment.
Thank you, Traci. Appreciate it.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.